Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
My friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Hey, Curt.
Hey, Pep.
You know, I was, this week, I was telling you last week before we started recording, I don't think I talked about this in the podcast, but I had this incident with my lawnmower where gas was, my riding lawnmower, where the garage was filled with gas because it was leaking. Well, so over the weekend, I decided I was going to fix it. So I took first thing I had to do, I said to my wife, no, I said, do you want to go, I'm going to run to the hardware store. I got to pick up a couple of things. And she said, okay. She went with me and she's like, what are we getting? And I said, well, I need a hose, some tubing, because I'm going to siphon the gas out of the lawnmower. And she's like, that doesn't sound like a good idea. I don't think you should do that. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to do it. Don't worry about it. So then I'm going to, then the deal is I got to take it off. I'm going to patch. I found where the area was and patch it. And
like you found a leak in the gas tank itself?
Yeah. It was some cracks, very fine cracks, but they were, gas was coming through. So anyway, so I Googled best way to siphon gas. Unfortunately, the next thing I Googled was, what do you do when you get gas in your mouth? Of course, my wife knows none of this. because she told me so.
Oh my gosh.
But I'm fine. I fixed it. I took it apart. I took it all. I was so proud of myself. I took it all apart, put it all back together again. It works. It's not leaking. So
how did you patch the gas tank?
There's this putty that you have to use gloves on it. You can't get it on your skin, but you soften it. You get it really soft, and then you just mold it in to plastic or rubber or anything that has a. And the gas tanks were like, I looked them up. They're like $350 for the gas tank, and
just for the gas tank itself.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, anyway, I just thought.
Well done, dude.
Yeah. Well done. Sort of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I have this vivid memory of my father doing this when I was a kid.
Siphoning.
Siphoning gas out of he had to get gas out of a tank of something.
Right.
And I still have this picture of him.
That's exactly right. You
try to you don't so is it coming? Is it coming? Is it coming?
Came so fast. I couldn't believe it. I was like, whoa. Oh my gosh. Oh,
man, it's like, well, gosh,
like
how many days later did you let yourself kiss your wife?
Oh, I mean, I didn't wait for that. Just a couple of mints and
Come on. Gosh, these mints smell like gasoline. They're gasoline flavored mints.
Too funny.
Oh, man.
We are in episode 3 of this little sort of mini season of mini episodes that we're doing here on confessional communities. And today we're going to be talking about the Symphony of Confessional Communities. And Curt, I know you wanted to remind us about the fact that we are always being formed.
Yeah, we're always being formed. And that we talk about the symphony because when we think about a symphony, we think about lots of different sections of an orchestra. These different things that are taking place. And we are being formed by lots of different things in our world. We talked about that formational process last time in our last episode. And one thing that we just want to remind ourselves of is that formational process, we like to say it's bi-directional, meaning that there are things that I'm giving of myself, as we'll get to. I'm giving of myself, but I'm also receiving. But every time I give or every time I receive, all the parties that are involved are going to be formed. So as I listen to other people reflect their story, or as I reflect mine, or as I reflect my experience of your story, this bidirectional movement, back and forth, is always in this relational vein that is just as we've been created. We've been made to operate this way. And, this is, again, is a thing that we like to say, and we'll talk in more detail about this in a couple of episodes from now, this notion that everything that we're doing in the consultation room, everything that we're doing in more detail, like it's happening in real life, but in the confessional community, we're just being much more explicit about it. We're naming these things. We're saying, hey, this is happening between us right here and now. And this is a way for us to be purposeful. We're increasing this, what we call in interpersonal neurobiology, we're increasing states of integration. We're becoming, in fact, we would say we're becoming more human, more real as human beings in this process. We're being formed into each of our particular versions of Jesus. And, we've talked about how these groups, these confessional communities have various features, features of the group psychotherapy, various features of the biblical narrative, features of interpersonal neurobiology. We're going to talk a little bit about that today and how these different things are actually in the process of forming us. And as we said, just as I mentioned ago, that when it comes to this notion of psychotherapy, I think there are a couple things for us to keep in mind. I think generally speaking, when we talk about psychotherapy, it's the word that we're using to reflect that what we really long to become are people of wisdom. We in our previous season that we just completed, this was a season on wisdom. The work of psychotherapy is the work of becoming greater people of wisdom. That's what we're really trying to do. And part of how we become people of wisdom is becoming increasingly aware of what is actually happening in the room between me and you, and what's happening within my head, and what am I doing with the things that are in my mind. If I am not aware that I have resisted being loved for most of my life because I grew up in a house where love was conditional, or love was painful, or love was brutal, I'm going to have good reason not to let you get too close to me, but I may not be aware at all that that's what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. But when we're in a group together, when we're doing this psychotherapy work, I'm going to discover, there's some things that I'm doing that are not just keeping you out, they're keeping God out as well. And so we see that what's happening in a psychotherapy setting are the same things that are taking place everywhere else outside the consultation room. But again, what sets it apart is that we are being explicit. We are naming what's actually happening here in my mind and what's happening between you and me. We're being explicit.
And so would you say that as you're going through that process in the confessional community and you're learning these things, you're then able to recognize when you're not in the room those same things going on, but you can see them and understand them more clearly now because you've done this practice in the room. That's
right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like lots of things that we do. As it turns out, we say we're practicing becoming professional human beings.
I love that.
We go to the putting green, and we're going to practice putting. We're going to practice our chipping. Or I'm going to go into the studio, and I'm going to sit down at the piano, and I'm going to do this one set of 6 measures in this particular concerto. I'm going to do this over and over and over and over. I'm going to because when it is time to perform, I want the music to own me.
Right.
But that requires that kind of practice, and that's what we're doing. We're becoming professional human beings, and we are being formed not so much by this thing that I'm just doing in my head. I'm being formed by what is happening between you and me. Mm-hmm. It's not like we come here and we just get information and then I just incorporate it. Kind of like I'm learning math, or I'm going to go home and memorize my alphabet. Now, there is that kind of work involved of intentionally repeating and remembering experiences I've had. But I'm not just like memorizing a list of boxes that I'm checking as a way to get information and therefore somehow I'll magically become a better person. No, I become a better person. I become a better putter. Not just by putting on the green, but by putting in front of a gallery of people who are watching me play. Like that's the real world. But I'm not going to putt well there if I'm not practicing on the green. And so we recognize that being in this practice setting that is a real reflection of life. It's not like fake life. It's real life that's happening in real relationships. What we're really working to do is to develop secure attachments for the purpose of wholeness. And this is the purpose of all relationships. It's not just the purpose of the relationships in psychotherapy or in the confessional community. We have been designed and destined to live in securely attached relationships. It happens to be that our own stories are fraught with unhealed wounds and trauma that we haven't really worked through or figured out. And consequently, I operate in the world as if it's not a secure place. I operate in the world as if relationships are dangerous. Now, we don't just walk up to people and say, "Well, I know that you're a dangerous person." Like I'm not doing that. But I am. I have parts of me that worry. Right. So I think back to I think back to the early days of our relationship, Pep, and there were some conversations, and I've had these with Amy too. I mean, there are conversations in which we've revealed things to each other that were really vulnerable, and there was enough trust, enough to take the next step and reveal the next thing, without a guarantee. Right. Now, like I think I'm trusting so far. And the fact that happens means that like I become more securely attached, certainly to you, but also that makes it easier to be more securely attached to Jesus, because as his representative in the room, as his body, right, as a representative of his body, like you are his person to me, I become more attached to him securely, because of this place about my story that I revealed to you that I'm not very proud of or that I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that you're going to... That's what we're doing in these relationships. And the reality is that this process of attachment in some way, shape, or form is going on with every relationship we have, even with the person who cuts us off in traffic, with the person who's checking you out of your grocery store. Now, it's not as deeply connected or as intense or whatever, but there are elements of it, right? So even when you express gratitude to somebody, it's a bid for attachment. It's a bid, even in a small way. It is a way in which I'm saying to that person, like, you're really important, and I want to just stop and say thank you so much for what you're doing, not just like the proverbial thank you and move on. And so this process of forming secure attachments is one of the primary things that is undercurrent to all of this work that we're doing. And that includes, as we've talked about in other seasons, that includes, first and foremost, if we're going to be in a confessional community, our willingness to work at being attuned. I first have to be attuned to myself, and that requires practice of me by doing that. I have to be curious about my own internal life, my inner life, and how I'm interacting with other people. I have to be curious about that, attuned to this. I have to be empathic. I have to be able to be empathic and to receive empathy. But I also have to do that just with a certain intention in mind. I'm moving this relationship in a certain direction. As we've said here before, sociopaths can be empathic, but their intention is to do harm. So it's possible to, give somebody the impression that you care, because it's an intentional behavior. But the question is, where am I leading this? Where do I want this relationship to go? And one of the first things then that we see that happens, you were thinking, do you have a question? Do you have something you were saying?
No, the question was the sociopath being empathetic. They have you said they have the ability to, I think you said, appear to care. So do they really have the ability to actually be empathetic and still
let's
act in a way that is harmful?
Yeah. So, I mean, in your work as an actor, there are plenty of moments in which you're on the stage or you're in front of the camera, and you're and with the person with whom you're acting, like if it's a friend or if it's your spouse or whoever it is that you're acting, and you're acting out a role in which you're being deeply empathic with that person. Well, are you, or are you just acting? Right? Like, you can become really good at doing this, and if I'm watching you on the screen, I'm like, wow, that character was like really empathic. And as soon as you're done, you're just you go to your dressing room and you do your thing, and you eat your lunch. It's not fake,
Right.
but the question is, what's the purpose? So this is what I mean. Like, empathy is an intentionally directed behavior that is necessary for the development of secure attachment. It's necessary. The question, of course, is, well, what's the intention behind it? If the intention is to give the audience a sense of an actor portraying this, I can do that. That's your purpose. And the person who you're acting with, like, after it's done, they're like, "Oh, dude, like, you were." It's like I felt like I had the experience of that I was being felt, right? Right. Yeah, but it's just a role, or is it? Right. So you see, like, we can do this because it's an intentional behavior. The purpose is, to what intention is it?
Got it. Yeah.
And we, with parenting, like, we do this all the time. Like, I put the part of me that wants to kill my child to the side, and I quiet my voice, to breathe, quiet my voice, and I'm going to be curious. I want to be empathic with my child when I have other things that are competing for that at the same time, because I have an intention of integration. I have an intention of wanting to move them in the direction that we want them to move. When people start in psychotherapy, though, it's this whole thing like, oh, I'm going to come in and be seen, soothed, safe, made to feel secure by the therapist. And immediately I start to do what we say, we outflank them, right? Because the very act of coming toward me, the act of healing, the necessary elements of healing require vulnerability. I'm going to be vulnerable. I have to be generous with myself. I can be, so the vulnerability, like, I'm bringing parts of me into the room that are hard to bring into the room. I'm going to be generous with that, generous in the space that I create for you, generous in my offering of my vulnerability. I'm not just going to do it one time. And I have to be willing to provide my presence. And then we see that if we're doing this in a group setting, if we do this in the setting of a community, one of the first obvious things is that there are more brains in the room than just two, just a therapist and their patient. And that means that if I'm in the room with 7 or 8 other people, there's, first of all, less room for parts of me to hide that want to hide, because I got more like, there's more eyes on me. There's more curiosity, literally. There's more curiosity in the room. And then the other thing that we often talk about, we've said this in other episodes and seasons, this notion that where our shame and our fear are the primary driving force behind our traumas, that shame is like a locomotive. That shame carries a great mass effect. And even if it's moving slowly down the track, I can't stop it, even if it's only moving at walking speed, because there's so much of it. But what I need is a bigger train. I need the collective community, and each person in this community is going to benefit from the collective community that enables us to have a different experience of our shame and our fear. We're building a bigger train to push back on that, so that I am not just feeling like I'm by myself having to deal with me, but I feel like I have everybody else in the room together with me dealing with me. One of the other things that we also want to do is that we talk about wanting to move from imagination to incarnation, this sense that, and we'll talk in more detail about this in the coming episodes, but we want to pay attention to the fact that I want to be as present in the room as possible. An example of this is that it's easy for me, something's you're in a room with people and they're having a conversation, and you sense that John is now kind of like anxious, and you say, "Tell me what you're feeling." And he says, "Well, I'm just anxious." And tell me what you're anxious about. Well, I think I'm a little worried about. I think I'm a little uncertain about what I want to say. Oh, what are you afraid is going to happen? Well, I'm afraid that that I might hurt somebody's feelings. You notice John's talking in the abstract.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about somebody's feelings. Well, the only somebodies are the other 7 or 8 people that are in the room. And so we say to John, give me names. Who are the people in the room that you're worried are going to think? Well, this actually, it's now no longer in the abstract of John's mind. It's in the room. We're talking about John and Sarah, or John and Paul. It's real people. And what are we really going to do with our embodied selves right here and now? We are taking things out of the imaginary space and bringing it into the incarnate space, where we can do the work that we're actually able to do. It's the difference between looking at your house on a blueprint that you want to build and actually ripping the boards of the 2x10s that you have to put up right for the rafters. It's the difference between we're now going to do the work. And that makes it much more easy to be real and to be remembered, because when those things happen in the room, we will then pause the process and say, we now want you to pay attention to this. And this is what we say. With this kind of practice over and over, it leads to what we call durable neuroplastic change. So John has this experience, and he talks to Paul, and Paul says, I'm totally cool with this. And so now John, in real time and space, has had an experience which he's named the thing that he's afraid of, that when he says it is going to hurt people's feelings. And he discovers that their feelings are not hurt, that they're actually quite able to hear this. And so we're going to send John home with an assignment. And that is, John, I want you to go back home, and I want you to write about, I want you to think about, I want you to replay what's just happened in the room. Twice a day, every day, between now and the next time that you come back. I want you to embed this in your remembered experience.
And so can you just take a second and talk about what is physically happening with John as he's doing that? Like the physical change that's happening when he's doing that practice?
Yeah. So at first, if we were to have John hooked up to a bunch of machines measuring his physiology,
mm-hmm.
we would notice that his heart rate, when he's thinking about talking, his heart rate's up, his throat's tight, palms are sweaty, and his mind is racing because he's trying to stay out of the room.
Right.
Actually. But when we invite him, without nagging him, without forcing him, when we invite him, say, put words to what your feeling is. And we will ask him, what are you feeling? Where are you feeling it in your body? And he'll say, my heart rate's up. Oh, let's take a couple of deep breaths. And so now, again, we're bringing him out of the abstract and into his body, right here and now, in the real world.
Present, yeah.
The only place that he exists. He doesn't exist in the past or in the future. He's right here and now. And once he calms, then I'll say who are the people that you're worried about? And it's gonna be hard, because he's gonna say it's Paul and it's Sarah that I'm worried about. And he's gonna notice Paul and Sarah looking at him, like, what are you worried that we're gonna say? What are you worried that we're gonna say when you? And then I say let's talk about talking about. And when he does this, we're gonna come back and say, tell me, now that you've heard from Paul, you've heard from Sarah, now what are you feeling? And he'll describe, I'm much calmer. And so he's had an experience of naming things to tame things, collaboratively with other people who are helping him do this. In addition to us saying, again, we'll get to this, bringing to his mind that this is not unlike what it was like for him to grow up in his house. That he would always be worried about saying that, so because he was trained to be worried. That people weren't, what he had to say and think and feel and stuff was not welcome here. He's not going to be okay. And so he's not being stupid. He's not being a coward. He's being himself. And so we're also going to draw his attention to how what he just did in the room is transforming and renewing the life, the old life that he's putting to death, as Paul would say. And he's creating new neural networks of trust about the things about his life that literally 15 minutes ago he couldn't tell anybody. It was just going to be the privacy of his own mind. And this is what real durable neuroplastic change is about.
And then you have him go and do that practice of writing it a couple times a day and going through thinking about, and that's reinforcing those neuropathic changes, correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And in many respects, this is what we mean when we are communally reflecting the image of God. Like this, what does God do? God is a God who, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 and following, he's a God who comes in and hovers over the chaos. He hovers. He's present to the chaos, both within and without. He's curious and creative, bringing order and purpose. And this is what we're doing between people. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, over and over and over and over again. And this is an example of how we are bearing and restoring the image of God to and with each other. And we do this with men and women in the room together, because that's how we are as human beings. We are not just all men or just all females. We are both, and we are doing this work together. And we are, in this way, we are mapping the text of the scriptures onto the experience of the community, because we are now, as a community, reflecting what God was doing in Genesis chapter 1. There's chaos in the room. Now, mind you, right, people are not throwing lamps at each other, but there's chaos internally. Like for John in that moment, like it's not fun inside of John's head or his body. But we are going to hover, and the group as a whole can hold this. We're going to hover, and we are going to bring order and purpose. Because it's not just about John clearing up his anxiety. It is about John building a relationship with Sarah and building a relationship with Paul. And he's going to build a relationship with other people who aren't even in on the conversation, but who are observing it in the room. This is what it means to be the body of Jesus. This is how we do this work. And as they do this work, one of the things that we would then make explicit is that this implicit work of God is exactly what's taking place in the room. And there are plenty of examples that we'll get to over the course of our time together. But there are just things that are important for us to know. Like, for example, in Genesis 12 and 13, we read about Abraham, and there were Canaanites in the land. The writers are reminding us that there are people in the land that are not for your transformation. There are things about my story, about my family system, that is resistant to renewal. We're reminded of this. What we want to do. You have not given me into the hands of the enemy, but have set my feet in a spacious place. This is Psalm 31:8. A wide place to stand. This body becomes a wide place for me, John, to stand, where I bring my distress and I fall over into your hands. It's risky. It feels frightening. And at the end of it, I'm in a different space. I'm not the same John that I was literally 3 minutes ago. Those are just a couple of examples. And in this way, we are expanding our imaginations, and I'm tuning in to the incarnation. I'm always bringing it back to being incarnate. I'm attuning to this, and I'm bringing the incarnation together. And so this whole notion of how does the process work, we're going to get into more detail in the coming episodes. It's important for us to recognize that we are coming to be attuned, we are coming to be vulnerable, we are coming to be generous, we are coming with our presence. We are not coming to fix other people's problems. We are not coming for other people to fix our problems, just to offer us solutions. We are coming to be present as God is present in the very first page of the Bible, and and the way he is present for the rest of the arc of the scriptures, how Jesus was present. This is who we are being to one another. And so with that in mind, we have just a transition. We're going to wrap this up, but talk a little bit about an artistic expression.
Yeah, we like to end each episode of the podcast with some sort of artistic expression. And this week, as we were talking about this whole idea of the confessional community and just the ideas of vulnerability, generosity, and presence, it made me think of poetry. and just the idea of the thought of sitting down and reading poetry can be a vulnerable act, and it can also be a very generous thing that you're doing for yourself, and it does have I think a unique ability to help us, to bring us present. And so I think it's worthy to spend some time in poetry. And one of my favorite poets, she was brought to my attention by, I've talked about Charles Nelson Riley, my teacher. Well, Charles conceived and directed the Broadway show, The Belle of Amherst, which was where Julie Harris won the Tony for playing Emily Dickinson. And so Charles was seeped into Emily Dickinson's poetry, and he was the first one to bring her writings to my attention. And this particular poem is called Hope is a Thing with Feathers. I'm sure all of us have had times when we've, needed to feel hope as something strong. And Emily Dickinson describes hope as this strong-willed bird that lives inside the human soul and sings its song to us no matter what's going on in our lives, and really requires nothing from us in return. So I'll just do this reading of this poem, Hope is a Thing with Feathers. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. And so this week, for our application, as we consider the people in your life by whom you are being formed, and also begin to practice paying attention to what you're actually sensing, imaging, feeling, thinking, and what reactions that you have in your body as you are in various relational settings. We want you to notice your emotional tone and how you're regulating it. Compare your response to what you most want your responses to be in those situations. This is all practice for the attentional work that is necessary to be present in confessional communities. And if you are so called, I invite you, as you are thinking about these things, to write them down. Maybe even in the form of a poem. And Curt, thank you for today. I'm loving feeling the experience of what happens in these rooms, and I'm sure our listeners are as well. Thanks for bringing this to us.
Yeah, you bet,
and if you are watching on YouTube, Amy's going to be joining us here in just a couple of seconds. Curt, love you.
Dude, always a pleasure, man. Love you too.
Oh my gosh. This stuff is so good. It's so good.
I'm just going to put that on repeat because, it's like
Make
Amy
it a
comes in the
ringtone.
room and
Make it a ringtone.
that's my ringtone.
Oh my gosh. Because, okay, so we're like, what happens in the room happens elsewhere, right? And then Pep, you said, okay, so when we leave the room, we're more aware of ourselves. We find ourselves outside. But, so we're in the room, and it's more intense, more focused. And people stay, like we've talked before. Like, just stay. Not everybody stays, but in the room, no one's getting up and leaving.
Well, and Curt, I'm sure you'll talk about this in another episode. I don't necessarily want you to talk about it here, but I know that I would assume there is an exit strategy in that things that you don't leave unless you're you've got to agree to these certain things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, or a certain
so that
amount
there
of
is that
time,
safety
or-
of knowing that no one's going to be running out the door.
Yeah.
You
Right.
know. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then, like the example of John, like things come up. So you're all sitting in this room, things come up, and we're oftentimes surprised by it. Like, huh, isn't this interesting? Or I'm running away internally. I'm not leaving the room, but I'm backing up. And
But
then
I'm
people
leaving
see
the
you
room.
backing up. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah. People see you backing up and they're like, huh, what's going on
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, no. Kurt, you've been pretty quiet for a while.
Yeah, I'm going to continue to be quiet. Yeah. So then there's like
Yeah.
this space where, that's not usually how my coffee with girlfriends goes. There's an element of this, but there's not the intensity, right? And then you take it outside and you're in your quote unquote real life and it's like, huh, I kind of understand that. I'm a little bit more familiar because I'm anxious that you're going to get mad at me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well, in fact, Amy, I just want to say this: that like what you just said is a crucial thing. Like I totally understand what you mean, and at the same time, and we'll talk about this in another episode as well. We like to say, it is true. People will come into the groups and say, "Well, look, okay, this is fine here, but like this isn't my real life."
yeah.
To which
yeah.
to which we say, in fact,
It is. It is.
it is the most
Yes.
real that your life
Yes.
is going to be. Because even, they say, well, there are all kinds of things that aren't really, we're not doing, we're not like eating together, we're not vacationing together, we're not cooking out together, we're not having sex together, we're not doing all these things that make life more real. I'm like, look, all those things that that you just listed are things that are physical expressions of the things that we hold inside of us, for which we can develop language and use words to say in such a way that the sex that we're not going to have, the cookout we're not going to have, we can still say, I would love to do that, but why? What's that about? What is it that I'm really looking for? What I'm looking for is like I just really want to be. I really like. I'm feeling the scarcity of being held.
Right.
And I'm in a sense in that right now. But like, where else would you be able
That's
to even
intimate.
become a?
That's intimate.
Right. It is. But where else would you become aware that that's at the core of who you
Right.
are? Like that's even happening. We wouldn't even know this.
You would just be grilling. Like you don't.
Right,
You're not
right,
aware
exactly.
of
We're just grilling, and we come, we say, hey, this has been great. We go, and like what I would really want to say is like, thank you so much for coming to my back deck and to be with me, because I just love being with you all because I feel held.
Right.
I feel like you want to be with me, like and this sense of how it is that this level of intensity of what is real. Is what we believe heaven is going to be about. And so if we think we can get away with living superficially, heaven is not going to end up being it may not be immediately comfortable for us.
Right. Well, and I know you know this, but when I say real life, I should probably say day-to-day life, because
Yeah.
it really is all that it does. It's the same. It does happen.
Yeah.
And like I thought the another metaphor of like, okay, going to the gym, you work out, it's intense, you're there for that purpose, and then I show up fit for my relationships. And
Right.
so the stuff that I've talked about deeply in the room follows me everywhere. And
Right.
then it's circular, right? Because it affects everyone we're with. That
Right.
it's going to change things.
Right. Because like you're going to gather with your girlfriends or with other people, whatever, and like they're going to have the experience of you asking questions that most people are not asking. Or they're going to have the experience of you offering reflections about where you are. Hey, how are you doing? You pause and you're like, what is she doing?
Right. Yeah.
And then you give people a real answer.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be an answer that that is like whatever.
Just a thoughtful answer.
A thoughtful answer that, because you're doing this work, in your thoughtfulness, the very way that you answer the question is necessarily and invariably going to affect them. And it's not just the information that you're giving them. It's they're witnessing your pausing and the tone and the content, all the things together. Like you are being the daughter of the king in the room, and like people can't get away from that. Like when the spirit is in the room and on fire, like you can't get away from it.
Right.
And when people see others, when people see people doing this with each other, this when Jesus says, and they will see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Or when Jesus says in John 12, and they will know that you are my disciples by the way you love one another. He's not talking about the way you're nice to one another.
Yeah.
He's talking about this.
It's infectious, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, infectious. And then, Pep, when you read the poem, and I loved your intro to it. I loved how you brought us into it. But even as you were reading it, I slowed down. Like I internally...
Oh, my gosh.
And that's the intentionality. That's all of this work. It takes slowing down, which is, as you say, Curt, counterintuitive to what we're used to. We're used to moving quickly and answering quickly, but it's like, okay. It's like when you're skiing or anywhere in the snow, and it snows, and it just all the electricity is silenced, and you don't even know there's a sound to electricity until it's snowing, and it's like this blanket of like, okay. So, Whew, I love this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, especially, Amy, as you mentioned, that sense of slowing down and so forth. We live in a world that trains us, actively trains us to move quickly, to move urgently. Social media, right? And by this, I'm not talking just about, there's a picture of my friends, so much of the social media that is involved in that supports the violence that we commit toward each other, right? The violence of words, having to do with all kinds of things. Those are acts that are often committed out of, urgent impulsivity. They're not acts in which I'm pausing, reflecting, being curious about myself, about my own wounds, about the others, about what does it mean for me to love one another here. I'm not considering that. But this kind of work literally puts our bodies in a position in which our bodies are given the opportunity to slow down and be more reflective and thoughtful and so forth, such that when I do leave that room to go into other parts of my day-to-day life, I become more fully formed as one who is more likely to pause, to consider before I say something, to consider whether or not I'm even going to check Facebook, let alone get on and look and there maybe write something. I'm just like, no. Because we will discover after a while that the practice of being present with others and learning how their presence brings me into a space of peacefulness, comfort, and confidence. I'm going to want more of that and less of the other, which means I'm going to be less likely to want to get on my phone and do all the things. Which makes it more possible for me to be something different with other people in my life. Yeah, Pep, what Amy was saying about the poem. I mean, for those who are still listening, I would say, like, I would love for them to read that, get that poem, and read that poem twice a day.
Yeah.
Right, for the next 7 days until just and just monitor what's it like, and not just read it silently, read it out loud, like you did. Read it out loud so that you're hearing the words that you're speaking, so your body is involved, not just your thinking brain.
Mm-hmm.
And notice, how does that change what your experience is as you're sitting there.
Yeah.
What you are you are introducing your imagination to this, and what is it like for you to be paying attention to this instead of Facebook?
Right.
And how is that creating opportunity for you to be more attuned and therefore more generous, more vulnerable, more present?
Yeah, it's, when I'm in the practice of taking that time to read poetry or take time just to really do something a practice that helps me be present,
Mm-hmm.
I find that even though my day can have a certain amount of chaos to it, if I'm continually spending that time through, throughout the day, or, for weeks at a time, especially, that even in the chaos, I'm able to be present and curious and more thoughtful with people and more generous with myself and more kind to myself. And I think poetry is a great of the great vehicles, and it's one of the great things that it can do. There's it can help us creatively. Sometimes it can be just wonderfully whimsical. Help us think differently, because it's a different cadence. It's a different pattern.
Yeah.
A different
It can
portal.
break. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah. No,
So-
say that more. No, about the break. Would say that.
Say the break. I don't know what I would.
You were about to say the break. So, like.
I think it can kind of break our rhythm a little bit up a little bit, which I
interrupt.
think interrupt us a little bit, which I think is a good thing to
Yeah.
not just
Right.
be
Shake
in
it
that
up.
same to shake it up a little bit.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
I wonder if on the show notes, if we can, I don't know if we can do this, but if there would be like even a couple more poems that you would think of we could put in the show notes in addition to Emily Dickinson's one.
Sure.
That
There is one other, and we'll put this one in there too. There's another Emily Dickinson poem that the first line is, "Let me tell you how the sun rose. Let me tell you how the sun rose, a ribbon at a time." It just
Ugh.
Did
What
you
an
say
invitation.
did you say
a ribbon at a time?
A
A
ribbon
ribbon at a
out of
time.
time. Holy freaking cow!
Yeah. Anyway, I will. I'll
that's
pull a
it.
couple for Kara.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
that's really
It's
good.
a bonus application.
Yeah. Well, it gets back to what we have said that is part of our mission and our vision here. That we long to be outposts of beauty and goodness. This is what we believe that as image bearers and restorers of God. And this notion that we become what we pay attention to. And we frequently talk about putting ourselves in the path of oncoming beauty. And I think about these poems, and I think about oh my gosh, like I want to, I wanted to just like read the poem again, and then read the poem again, and then read the poem again. Like just sitting in that cadence and that rhythm and that imagined space. It's like having a massage for your mind. Just
And soul. It's like,
yeah.
it's like,
Yeah. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And I think too that again, getting back to this notion you were saying about the cadence and so forth, it's that notion of hovering. right? It's this notion that God comes to the chaos as a poet. He's not, he's not coming as the 3rd Marine Division.
Yeah.
He's coming as a poet. And this reminds me, we've talked about this many times, of the cellist of Sarajevo, right? Where in the bomb crater, I mean, he's just going to play. And you're like, that's just you just think like that's just lunacy. Like, what the heck are you doing? Until he does it, and you're like, I don't know what's happening here, but what do you know? Like nobody's shelling anybody. Yeah, and that's what we long for these confessional communities to be an outpost of the emerging beauty and goodness that with intention says, bring your chaos. Because that's the world that we live in. Like, we live, as our friends at the Bible Project would talk about, like Adam and Eve could no longer tolerate living in the Garden of Eden. So they had to leave the garden. They didn't leave Eden. They had to leave the garden. But then Cain couldn't even tolerate being in Eden. After he did what he did to his brother, he left Eden. Further out into the wilderness, where we now find ourselves. This is where we are. We're in the wilderness. We're trying to make our way back, and how do we, and we're violent, and we commit violence as a way to do it. I'm like all my envy and all the things. And beauty is God's invitation for us to consider what we're really longing for, but not just what I'm longing for, but how I want to receive it. And in this chaos, in the wilderness where we find ourselves, God's asking us to be like him and hover. Jesus, looking at Jerusalem, how long have I wanted to gather you as a mother hen gathers her chicks and hovers with them? And as people of God, this is what we're called to do and to be. And confessional communities is one way that we think can be really helpful in helping us practice that.
Love it.
Yeah.
It's good.
It's good stuff.
Okay, guys.
All right, guys. Yeah.
What a joy. All right. Till next time.
Till next time.
Love you.
You too.
Love you too. This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.